What is that?
Hey, sorry, did you drop a clock or something?
What is 238?
We made this short to test out if we needed more than 4 focal lengths to tell a story. Granted, it's not a long story, but we got all our bases covered in terms of wides and close-ups. This was all using the brand new Mars lens set from Sirui, who's sponsoring this video. Does this mean all these lenses are boys since men are from Mars? Anyway, Sirui basically took all the feedback from the serious cinema people and put it into these bodies. And we'll get to that part. But let's first talk about making choices. How many times have you wondered, which lens do I want and which focal length? The first question is huge, but the second one is a bit more manageable. And that's what we'll be looking at in this video. We'll also tackle a lot of really tempting misconceptions about focal lengths, like compression and crop factors. Most people think of focal length as a measurement expressed in millimeters, which is sort of shorthand for how wide a lens will go. How much of the space can you see? The shorter the focal length, the wider the lens. And while that's broadly true, there's more to it than that. Where does that measurement, that length, actually come from? A lot of people assume it's a measurement of the lens itself, or one of its elements. But that's not correct. It's actually the distance from the optical center of the lens to the camera sensor when the lens is at infinity focus. This distance determines the angle of view or field of view that will be captured by the camera. A short focal length, like 10 millimeters, will capture a much wider field of view than a long focal length, like a 75 millimeter lens. Because bringing the optical center of the lens closer to the sensor increases that angle of view. This is why, generally speaking, wide-angle lenses are used for broad, establishing shots, and longer focal lengths are used for close-ups. But choosing a focal length is about much more than field of view, after all. It's about what's in the frame. And there's another way to change what's in the frame by simply moving the camera and the lens closer or further away from the subject. Why don't we just do that all of the time? After all, 50mm lenses are historically the cheapest focal length and can be found in very fast apertures. So why not just buy one of those and move the camera? As an obvious first point, sometimes moving the camera is not possible. There is a variety of practical reasons why it's sometimes necessary to shoot closer or further from your subject, and therefore you need to adjust your focal length to get the framing that you want. For example, right now, we're shooting across the street. And if we wanted to get the same framing using a shorter focal length, that would put the camera smack in the middle of traffic. And that's no good. More significantly, there's major aesthetic and stylistic reasons to choose different focal lengths, including field of view, but also the properties of compression and distortion. You can get a mid-shot of a character with just about any focal length by changing the distance between the camera and subject. Even though the character will appear a similar size, the background and foreground around that character will go through drastic changes. A 15mm lens framing a mid-shot is going to show a lot more of the environment around that character than a 75mm with similar framing. Is it really shocking, the difference? For The Shining's maze sequence, Stanley Kubrick used a very wide 9.8mm lens to frame the murderous Jack Torrance lurching through a snowed-under hedge maze. The character is framed close enough for us to feel his frantic lunacy, yet we still get a wide enough background to bring in the walls of the maze, giving it a claustrophobic tunneling effect. Now here's something you might have heard before. Changing focal length doesn't just affect the wideness of a shot, it also changes the depth of the shot. As you move to longer focal lengths, the environment and objects around your subject will appear larger than they did on the wider lens. It becomes harder to tell how far apart things are as foreground, middle ground, and background get pressed together. That's why we say longer lenses compress the background. And that's not exactly correct. For compression to happen, we need to be comparing a wider lens with a long one while keeping the subject the same size in the frame. To do that, we have to move the camera, and that's where the misconception comes from. If we don't move the camera and match framing by reducing the recorded area with a crop, you'll see that the background looks about the same with any lens. The idea that longer lenses compress the scene comes from moving the camera and thus changing the perspective lines when compared to the wider shot. That's the principle of the dolly zoom. So next time someone tells you that longer lenses compress subject and background together, please remember this and try to prevent the misconception. Now that we took that out of the way, there are still plenty of situations where you might choose a longer lens to create a shot that's not a close-up, but a medium or a wide for creative purposes. Hoyt van Hoytema does this in Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy in an airplane runway using a 2000mm lens. The super narrow field of view keeps characters and background about the same size, making it impossible to tell how far that airplane really is and create increasing tension. You'll put your camera much further from your characters and start to confuse the audience about the distance between subject and background. In this shot of Multiverse Dating for Beginners, I used a 300mm f4.5 lens to superimpose the characters over the nighttime city background. But when we're in the action, moving with them, 300mm was just not doable. So we had an 18 to 35mm, and the way the city looks in the background is completely different. The camera is moving around this location with the characters in close range, while when we're up there, I had to go out of the park, across the street, halfway up a block, just to get that one 300mm shot. We also see this a lot in sports, such as baseball, where if we didn't have the wide shots or didn't know the size and shape of the field, the long lenses used to frame the players would make it hard to figure out how far the dugout or the audience is. Let's go back to keeping our subject framing consistent by moving the camera back and forth. As well as these changes to the background, the subjects themselves will appear different due to distortion. Changing focal lengths will give you a fundamentally different look and feel as the camera moves closer to the subject. Have a look at these images of a headshot at different focal lengths, but similar framing. The wider focal lengths make the nose and eyes larger and even bulbous, and seem to narrow the face relative to the nose. This means that certain focal lengths can be used to flatter human faces. Although for the purpose of this video, we should really say flatten. And for this reason, 75mm is a popular length for portrait photographers as it doesn't distort their subjects' faces. In contrast, the distorted look of wider lenses can be exploited for an unnatural, stylistic effect. Given these significantly different looks, it's no surprise that revered directors over time have chosen a broad variety of focal lengths over shooting an entire film with just one lens. Although that does happen too. But before we get into that, there's an important additional factor to consider when reviewing the look of a film, and that's whether it was shot in anamorphic or spherical, since anamorphic is a special type of distortion. I've talked a bunch about the history of anamorphics in Module 1 of the cookbook, so you can check that for origins. The important bit here is anamorphics distort only in the horizontal axis of the image to fit a wider field of view into the frame. The resulting effect is a 50mm anamorphic lens retains the vertical field of view of a 50mm spherical lens, but with a wider field of view. Depending on the squeeze factor of the lens, it could be 1.33, 1.5, or even twice as wide as the equivalent spherical lens. The process of squeezing and de-squeezing the image also leads to a number of unique visual traits that have become highly sought by filmmakers, such as streak flares, edge distortion, and beautiful oval bokeh. Most of this episode's being shot on Sirui anamorphic lenses, which give us roughly 30% wider field of view and slight oval bokeh. With that in mind, let's look at some of the common focal lengths used over time. Broadly speaking, we can define 4 categories. In the ultra-wide range, you have directors working in 12 to 16 millimeters, and even wider on occasion. In a kind of standard wide range, you have 18 to 28 mil as a common group used by major directors. And our standard lenses are generally between 35 and 55, and are very popular with indie filmmakers because of their versatility and affordability. The nickname Thrifty 50 exists for a reason. Long focal lengths generally start around 75 millimeters, although they can get much longer, as we saw in the Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy example. The slightly unnatural look of an ultra-wide angle up close has been used by many directors, including Terry Gilliam's In Brazil, or Darren Aronofsky's Requiem for a Dream, for example. Ultra-wide distortion is exploited to give a strong sense of unease. Another fan of the ultra-wide angle is Terrence Malick, who often works with 12 to 16 mm lenses to create sweeping epic vistas that invite the viewer to slowly consider the detail and nuance of his imagery. A world so deep that the environment itself can seem like the protagonist. Humans are small in comparison and swept along by the will of the environment rather than driving their own destinies. These ultra-wide angles can be fairly extreme. And if we're talking about anamorphic, there's not a lot of visual traits that stand out at such wide focal lengths. So if you need something this wide, you might as well shoot spherical and crop it in. It's in the 18 to 28 mm range you have many of the greats, Orson Welles, Steven Spielberg, and Martin Scorsese, among others. These are still considered wide-angle lenses and incorporate these broad views and big worlds, yet they allow for focus on the human characters that inhabit these worlds. They transpire an epic feel, but also a sense of the characters navigating that deep world, struggling with their fate, fighting against the forces that seek to bring them down. It's no surprise that many blockbusters are shot at these focal lengths. It's also no coincidence this is Surei's widest lens at 24 millimeters, allowing us to take in the surroundings of our character while not disconnecting from them. This one goes really well on a gimbal or Steadicam and make good use of foreground elements to add depth to your shots. Alfred Hitchcock favored the middling 50 mm focal length. His frames, like his films, are tight and tense. We see enough to hint at the story's progression, but not enough to ever know exactly where it's going. The broad sweep and grandeur of the wide frame is too open, too slow, and too revealing, useful only to establish the environment. Hitchcock is a master of control, and the tighter focal length allows him to direct our attention. He wants to walk us through the maze rather than unfurl the vista. Kurosawa preferred to work between 35 and 50 mm for most of his career. Wes Anderson has favored 40 mm for some of his most iconic pictures. And you can also find Tarantino and Coppola favoring this range. This is where FOMO gets you, because Sirui offers both a 35 and a 50 mm, and some folks feel that there's a best choice here. There isn't. These are different focal lengths, and they deliver different looks. On a tighter set, you might reach for the 35 mm for a medium shot, while in a more open location, the 50 mm jumps at you, or vice versa. So, I surely use both of them all the time. Then, at the longer end, we have Ridley Scott, who favors working with 75 mm lenses, perfect for the walled-in, terrifying world of a small ship housing a huge alien. But before you commit only to the focal length of your favorite director or film, we need to talk about sensor sizes, which fundamentally change the equivalent field of view of the lens you're using. We're going into the messy world of crop factors and misconceptions, some of which I'm guilty of myself. Most of the films we're discussing were finished on Super 35 3 or 2 perf film. which are almost equivalent to APS-C digital sensors, not full frame. The exact size of these sensors varies slightly from manufacturer to manufacturer. The theoretical correct size would be 24 by 13.5 millimeters for video recording. But now it seems everybody's got the full frame bug, and all focal lengths became relative to full frame. This is the origin of crop factors. Mitch Gross is a strong advocate against the modern-day crop factor obsession, and as he puts it, a lens is a lens is a lens, and it doesn't know what camera, what size or format you have that it's shooting to. It doesn't matter to a lens. You know how it goes. If you have a 50mm lens on a full-frame camera, that'll match a 25mm lens on a 2x crop factor camera. I mean, it kind of looks true, doesn't it? But what most of these comparisons fail to take into account is the depth of field. So by setting up a comparison between the MFT 35mm and the APS-C 50mm, that should give us pretty much the same field of view. One big difference that you can see is the quality of bokeh. The bokeh is much more pronounced on the 50mm on a bigger sensor, although our framing is the same. So while you're still getting the same field of view with different focal lengths, you're not getting the same depth of field. And that's a pretty big difference that crop factors don't take into account. I'm out of here, bye. Why is this relevant? The original Sirui lenses are designed for APS-C, but the Mars set only comes in MFT, so you will be using a smaller sensor area, and it's easy to start thinking, wait a minute, if the widest lens is a 24mm, that's like a 50mm on MFT, and that's way too tight. Except it's not really. That's just gas talking and gear review overdose. You wouldn't walk up to Spielberg saying, hey man, doesn't it suck that Super 35 film is so small? Like your 50mm is pretty much a 75mm? Those are just numbers, and there are several ways to compose a shot with any focal length to serve the story. The 1.33 anamorphic squeeze helps with that, and having a variety of focal lengths to choose from also helps. So chill at being stuck on theoretical numbers and go out to shoot. In our test shot for this episode, we never got to a situation where our widest lens wasn't wide enough to make the shot work. You also know that lenses either have a fixed focal length and are known as prime lenses, or have a variable focal length, which are zoom lenses. While zoom lenses are obviously more versatile, historically speaking, prime lenses have always been sharper, faster, and cheaper. This old age idea still holds for a lot of cinematographers out there, although we've had quite a handful of zooms in recent times that outperform primes. Some of them super affordable, like Sigma's ART 18 to 35mm and 50 to 150mm. Others not as affordable, like Canon's 2470 f2.8 Mark II. So when deciding between primes and zooms, don't default to primes are always better performing. I talked a bunch about anamorphic zooms in Laowa's review, and if you want to go deeper into that subject, just check out that video. There are some other practical considerations as well. 50mm lenses are often the cheapest, particularly among vintage lenses. Wide angles typically have smaller apertures, and so aren't as effective in low-light environments. Telephoto lenses can get very large and heavy, and might not sit well on a gimbal. For the Sirui MARS Set, they've done a great job of making these lenses stick to many cinema standards. The bodies are roughly the same size, with identical places for focus and iris gears, as well as identical filter threads. This makes work on set much easier when swapping lenses or auditioning a particular lens for a shot. They only come in MFT mount at this point, and I'd love to see more options for different cameras, although my GH5 II is very happy with this arrangement. The set costs $4,000 and comes in a hard case that will save you time and money. I've made several other videos about the Sirui lenses so far, and I recommend you watch some of them to learn more about their personal traits, strong aspects, and challenges. It just doesn't bode well to keep repeating the same thing over and over in every video. So when you're choosing a focal length for your next setup, think about the practicalities of the environments you'll be working in, as well as the story that you want to tell. Are you shooting indoors in small rooms? Or are you shooting in limited natural light that requires a fast aperture? Is it a sweeping epic in 24mm? A character-driven drama in 35 or 50mm? Or is it a tense thriller in the claustrophobia of 75mm? Do you want to invite the audience to slowly peruse the beauty of your frames, or hint at that hidden terror around the corner? Does the shot require that you enhance the beauty of your talent as the protagonist falls in love? Or that you distort their face in the middle of your hero's bad acid trip? And if it all sounds too convoluted, make it simpler. Get a set of cheap primes from as wide as you can go up to, I don't know, 100mm, shoot a bunch of shots, and see what you like. As always, the rules are there for a good reason, but they're also made to be broken. And I always wanted to say that. So find the focal length that you like and start shooting. Thank you so much for hanging out, and I'll see you on the next one. Chitufadungs, out. Why don't we just, okay, yeah, you looked up. I know you want me to redo that. For video recording.
Oh.
This will never land. Oh yeah.
Every shot.
So close.
Reset itself.
I can take out the...
Me coming like...
And then... Oh, here we go. Guess that's that.